What's the difference between a lawmaker and a policymaker? Hi, I'm Eldrick Tinkertoyat. Every now and then we hear these two terms being used in the news. Depending on which market you're in or which jurisdiction you're in, it can overlap and it can represent two distinctive groups of people. I'd like you to remember the theory of the separation of power. Under the theory of separation of power, there are three branches of government. You have the legislature, which makes the law. You have the executive, which implements the law or makes policies. And you have the judiciary, which interprets the law, if you will, and passes judgment. So using this basis, you have two or three common models. Well, it's actually two common models. The first model will be the Westminster Model. Westminster Model is the model that's used in the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth nations. So the idea is, under the Westminster system, the executive is appointed, or rather members of the executive at the decision-making level or the policy-making level are appointed from among members of Parliament. Right. So the executive and the legislature somewhat intertwine, or rather it's a subset of the legislature. So the Prime Minister, the Premier or Prime Minister would be a member of the lower house, more often than not, depending on the constitution, and appoints cabinet members, deputy ministers from Parliament. The judiciary would be independent. Under the Washington model, which is adopted by many countries like the United States, the distinction is quite clear and separated. The separation is quite obvious. So members of the government, members of the executive, if you will, can be drawn out from the legislature, but upon appointment, they must resign their post. Think when President Obama appointed Senator Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. Upon appointment, she resigned her position as a US Senator to take up the office of US Secretary of State. So members of the executive and members of the legislature are separated. There's a clear-cut distinction. Now, why do I bring this up? Okay. Policymakers are often those that fall in the executive. Yes, you have the ministers, the members of the cabinet, whether they're the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and so on and so forth, Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, and so on and so forth. But you also have the civil servants. The civil servants support the cabinet members in implementing the government's policies, in executing the government's plans. I mean, let's be realistic. The health policy is not executed by the health minister. It is made into effect by the health minister, but executed by those in the Ministry of Health, according to their respective departments and domain. Likewise, the defense policy is formulated at the minister level, at the cabinet level, and it is executed by the Ministry of Defense and the different components, including the armed forces. As we go along, I mean, there are many professional and support roles within the civil service, which includes, if you're looking at the Ministry of Education or Department of Education, you have the teachers in schools. At the same time, some teachers serve as administrators. Moving up, you have the district, in the case of Malaysia, you have the district education department that ensures that at a more larger level, at a district level, at a division level, if you're in Sabah or Sarawak, or residency level, the administration is consistent. There's an oversight, a degree of oversight. So policymakers, they come up with policies, how the country would move forward, how the state or the division or the local government, depending on their constitutional authority accorded by the respective constitution and laws, how it would move forward, how it would implement those legislature. Right? Policy requires the intervention of policymakers. It could be, again, at the highest level, the minister. It could be the Secretary General of the Ministry. It could be the Director General of the departments or agencies. It could be the head, the Director General of the different agencies. Law, on the other hand, comes under the jurisdiction of the legislative branch. When you're talking about law, in the context of Malaysia and other Commonwealth countries, we're looking at Acts of Parliament. Acts of Parliament govern, unless otherwise specified, govern the whole country. It is uniform throughout the country. At a state level, for instance, in Malaysia, in Canada, in Australia, and even in the United States, the state legislature has a degree of autonomy, has exclusive jurisdiction over certain matters. For instance, in Sarawak, the Dewan Undangan Negeri, or the State Legislative Assembly, has jurisdiction over the state budget, forestry, land matters, religious matters, as well as native customary rights or native customs. It is not within the jurisdiction of Parliament. So laws can only be passed by the respective authority or organization. Often, these organizations are elected. Often. There are instances where they are ex officio members, like in the state legislative assemblies, or in the case of Parliament, or the Malaysian Parliament, you have the upper house that is appointed, either appointed by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, with and by advice of the Prime Minister, or elected by the Dewan Undangan Negeri of the 13 states that make up the Federation of Malaysia. To pass a law, there is a legislative process. Parliament, it is repeated in the two chambers. For unicameral or single chamber institutions like the state legislative assemblies in Malaysia or the state legislature of Nevada, it's only done once. So the lawmaking process begins with the introduction of the bill in the first reading, then the second reading where the principles of the bill is debated, then you have the committee stage, then the third reading, the reading of the whole house, and finally it's either signed, if it's bicameral, it goes to the second level, the second chamber. If it's a unicameral legislature, it will be sent to the head of state, right? So basically there's a legislative process. Both these two processes, as I said, impact the direction of businesses, it impacts the direction of communities, it impacts the direction of the country or the state. How it goes about is, in a nutshell, the law enables policy, not the other way around. Okay? Government institutions can only act in the event that there is a law. That is why certain laws are passed to enable the government to act accordingly. This is similar to companies. Companies have memorandums or articles of association which states what the company is about. Anything beyond this, the company has act ultra vires or act beyond its authority. So likewise, when it comes to lawmaking process and policy making process, we have to understand the first question to ask is there a law that enables the executive to create a policy for that area or that domain? If there is none, a law must be passed. If the answer is yes, there is a law, therefore it is imperative that the parties interested study the law and the subsidiary legislation. Okay, that's another thing which I would like to bring up. Subsidiary legislation are pieces of legislation made by the executive, not by Parliament. Okay. Parliament, through acts of Parliament, empowers the executive branch to make laws, subsidiary legislation, based on the spirit, the principles and parameters of that act of Parliament. So we have many subsidiary legislation known as orders, known as regulations, passed or made by policymakers based on the authority given by the Act of Parliament. There's so many things that's coming into play right now, right? But it's actually quite boring for most, right? So when we petition to any government, when we say things like, oh, government should come up with a policy for, this is the consideration that we have to ask. First, is there a law? Second, if there is no law, should one be introduced? How long will it take? The legislative process can span a long period of time. It can span years, it can span months. It depends on the urgency of the matter. It depends on the ability to adopt the measures. Because any law passed has a cost of implementation. So whether it's in the United States, in Malaysia, in the United Kingdom, in the People's Republic of China, every law passed, every law made has a cost. Someone has to uphold the law. And that law will then allow the executive to come up with the right policy. So immigration policies are based on the Immigration Act. Okay? The road transport policies or the national automotive policies are based on the law. What happens if a minister or if the government passes a policy or issues a policy that is not based on law? This is where things get interesting. Basically, that policy stands on air. Because again, the ability of any agency to execute the policy depends on the existence of a law enabling it to do so. Otherwise, that agency is acting outside of its authority. So what happens? What happens after that? The population, the citizens, people concerned, people with locus standi, people with legitimate interest can bring this matter to court. And the courts will then decide the validity of the policy and the law, depending on the case. So this is, in a nutshell, in under 15 minutes, the difference between a lawmaker and a policymaker. In a way, I mean, I covered quite a lot. I've covered the legislative process, the policy, a touch of policy, public affairs, basically. So this is the difference between a policymaker and a lawmaker. Policymakers are often unelected. Okay, often unelected. Yeah, they're generally not elected, except for the head of government. In the Washington Model, in Westminster Model, they're semi-elected. And lawmakers are often elected because they are appointed lawmakers. So we haven't covered other areas like the conflicts within the legislature. We haven't covered the conflicts within the executive branch. It's almost 15 minutes, so I'll do that in a different video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it has been insightful. Do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you and have an awesome day ahead. Bye.